Hello, welcome back to Lux Christus. I'm your host Owen, and you're listening to the continuation of a series called Bringing Every Thought Captive, where we explore issues of worldview and seek to shine the light of Christ to every issue. Specifically, we seek to live in light of 2 Timothy 3:16, which says all Scripture is inspired by God and profitable for teaching, for reproof, for correction, for training in righteousness, so that the man of God may be adequate, equipped for every good work. For this season, my guest and I will be dealing with the question about race and justice in light of Scripture, which is the Word of God and therefore adequate to equip us for every good work, including justice. And therefore, we'll be wrestling with some questions today about what is justice, not just dealing with other ideologies that may go against Christ, but also shining the light of Christ and showing what the good, the true, and the beautiful is. And so with that, I'm joined with my guest, Pastor Zach, and may you enjoy this episode. Thank you. Just to start off this section, I'll ask the question, what are some guidelines and principles on what is biblical justice and just how we can understand and have that foundational worldview?
Yeah. So I'm going to steal from Calvin Beisner. He's got a little booklet. It's I think it's titled Biblical Justice. You know what? Don't quote me on that. But it's like 28 pages. It is pretty easy. It's straightforward. And I think he does a great job of creating some categories for ways to see you kind of view justice, at least through a biblical lens. And so I'm going to steal from him because I think it helps simplify things a bit in a way that I think makes sense. So one of the first kind of components of it is impartiality in the application of the law. And and what that's getting at is you're not showing favoritism, so you're not allowing one person to break the law and then the other person to break the law. And typically, the way you saw that happen in the Old Testament was those in power, those in authority, often looking, or those that had the ability to do something about injustices or about people breaking the law, were looking the other way because, hey, this person is wealthy, or this person was a friend, or this person was that. So a lot of times it was, having to be a person that's in power or influence. But the reality is Leviticus 19:15 basically tells us you shouldn't show favoritism to the rich or the poor, and application of the law. And so I think God wisely puts that in there because he knows that while more often than not it's going to be people with power that are going to abuse their power, you also can't sometimes power isn't necessarily always seen in the right light. So you may be extremely wealthy, but you might not have any power. And you could be extremely poor, especially if you're in a mob. The mob's going to have a lot of power. I mean, do you think all those Jews that were demanding Jesus to be executed were the wealthy elites, those that had power and authority? And no. I mean, the mob was just your average everyday Jew. It was the quote-unquote oppressed people. The Romans were up here, the Jews were on the bottom, and then you had some of the Jewish leaders above. But the reality was the mob was full of just poor, downtrodden people, and they were still perverting justice. They were demanding the murder of someone that wasn't guilty of what he was being accused of.
Yeah.
So,
and I think,
No.
Just to go off on something real quick, and I think that's important, especially, we kind of have the image in our system of I think it's a lady with two, she's lifting up these two things and she's blind. She has that blindfold, and so kind of how justice, it isn't discriminating based on poor or rich, and it's not showing that favoritism. And another thing I thought of when you mentioned kind of that power thing is there's that verse of the love of money is the root of all evil. And so it's just interesting how in the Bible, it's not money necessarily that is the root of evil, but it's the love of it.
Yep.
And so whether you're rich or you're poor, you can have that. Yeah. And so the command, do not covet, it applies to all of us, and even us who have, we can covet, and those who don't have can covet. And so I just think the importance of that is that we all are capable of like doing injustice and kind of having that. So I think that's important point.
And I think that's a really good point. God's law cuts both ways. I think it's interesting that they use the image of a double-edged sword. So it doesn't matter which way you swing it; it's cutting down. Whether it's rich or poor, man or woman, whatever other kind of dichotomy you can create, it creates this equal scale, and that's where it's interesting because we say thou shalt not covet, or you don't covet your neighbor's belongings or whatever, but it's funny because people that are some of the wealthiest people in the world can still struggle with coveting, still desiring things that God hasn't given them. And so we kind of like, oh yeah, well, of course the poor person does it, because he doesn't have anything, but the rich person, well, he's got everything. But it doesn't matter. We're like, if I'm middle-class American, am I supposed to look at like Bill Gates or whoever with envy and jealousy? It's like, why the heck does he have all this stuff? No. If I'm going to judge Bill Gates, I'm going to judge him on his willingness to conform to God's standards, not because, oh, this guy's got a bunch of money. Because him having a bunch of money, that's none of my business. That's between him and God. If he uses it to abuse people and it's in a public setting, that's another conversation. But just because he has a bunch of money doesn't give me the right to be, jealous or envious of him.
Yeah.
And so the question kind of to be asking is, when we're looking at justice is, are we creating equal scales for applying the law? Do we favor one group over the other? Do we favor rich over poor, men over women? And in the discussion of race, are we creating laws that favor one people group over another? Are we favoring people with one skin colors? Like, don't allow blacks into this building. I was like, well, yeah, you're blatantly showing favoritism. Or no whites allowed. Yeah, you're showing favoritism. But that's one of the questions we need to be willing to ask: is are we showing impartiality in applying the law? Now, caveat: I don't think that impartiality is always wrong. I'm quite impartial to my kids. I love my kids a lot. And while I love, I like volunteer at the kids' school and all that stuff, and I enjoy hanging out with all the other crazy little 5 and 6 year olds, the reality is my love, my affection is going to be different for my son than it will be for other people. And that's, technically that's impartiality. I'm showing favoritism to my son. Like when I walk past him in the classroom, sometimes I'll tickle his ear and mess with him. I don't do that to other kids. A, because that's probably weird. But because my son, that's a love language for him. Me messing with him, he knows that's me showing my love. So I think I just want to throw that caveat out there. Not all partiality is necessarily wrong.
Yeah. But
we've got to figure out, what's the context? Is it applying law? Is it applying God's calling to us? And then what's the kind of discrimination? Like, how are we differentiating between this group that I'm showing favoritism for and this group that I'm not showing favoritism for? But that could be a whole nother discussion, is what's biblical partiality and what's not.
Yeah, I think you have that with every biblical command. Like, for example, we're told to love, but we're also told to hate evil. And so hatred in one context is sin, but the lack of hatred in another context is also sin. And so it's same with the impartiality thing of it's kind of just the way the Bible works, is it expects us to apply logic and wisdom to realize that's talking about a context and how most things are like that, was kind of has balanced. But yeah.
So that's one, is impartiality, especially in the application of law. Now, the second one is proportionality, so that there's symmetry between the initial acts. So on the one hand, symmetry between the acts on one hand and the reward or punishment on the other. And so let's say I steal, some candy from the store. Well, death penalty probably isn't proportional. So in Leviticus 24, they lay out some the death penalty. And so murder, like warranted death penalty, and like an injury was for injury, an eye for an eye, not an eye for not life for an eye type thing. So there was these kind of proportional things. So you're not going overboard, or you're not minimizing. So I just murdered someone. Oh, hey, can you give me $5 and we'll call it good? Like, we just minimized human life. I mean, I think the death penalty is God's institution of death penalty is really interesting, because people don't like it really nowadays, but also it's interesting because it says something about the Imago Dei. It says something about how valuable human life is. Like, no other, it's like all these things that people can do, but like when you murder someone, dude, that's your life. That costs your life. Like, there's other things where it's like, I kind of alluded to it earlier, but you steal, an oxen, you have to give back 2 oxen or something. I don't remember the exact numbers, but you're always paying back more than what you did, you took, as a way of like compensating. So not just like, oh, there's no punishment, but there is a punishment.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the idea.
Yeah, and I think that's important because like it almost like shows the value of the individual when you have that proportionate, because like if you overdo it, then it's like it's not showing them love in that case and true justice. And then if you don't do it, like if you undermine it, if you lower it, then it's like it's not showing the true value. So like, and like you mentioned murder, but also like in the Old Testament, like in the case of rape, like the rapist would be also face the death penalty. And so it's God was saying, this is how valuable like the woman is to me. This is how valuable this life is. And so it shows how God really cares about his creatures and his image bearers. And something we in our culture are outraged when we see maybe like a rapist or a murderer get away with like a few years in jail and that's it. And it's like, so there's something in us that longs for that. There needs to be equal compensation when it comes to law and justice and that kind of stuff. And then I guess going on to the third point, unless we have any more caveats.
No, I was just going to say, like, just as we're talking about this, let's see. Yeah, I'll just there's some questions to ask, because depending on the victim and the perpetrator, just wanting to be kind of mindful. So, like, when you're talking about proportionality and you're talking about symmetry between the initial act and the punishment, questions is like, who's the victim? Who's the perpetrator? Are we adequately responding to the offense? Are we overreacting to the offense? Are we not? And it kind of can even tie back a little bit to the partiality discussion, because are we trying to figure out, is this person like a worthy victim or not? Murder, assaulting a kid versus an adult, like trying to figure out, is the victim an adult or a child? Because even though it's heinous to an assault of an adult, assaulting a child is even more heinous. You're assaulting someone that's even more defenseless. And it would be a whole other discussion, but even Proverbs, so Proverbs 6 is talking about, or one of the things that is mentioned in there is this short little thing: men do not despise a thief if he steals to satisfy his soul when he's hungry, but if he is found out, he shall restore sevenfold. He shall give all the substance of his house. So the idea is, look, he's still going to be required to pay back whatever he stole. And so if a poor man, they're basically saying, look, people understand why a poor person steals. It doesn't make it right, and he still needs to have the consequences applied to him. And so it's both trying to have that proportionality as well as this impartiality. And I think there would be another discussion to go into, like, what were the normal laws, because I think there's a connection between what the normal punishments were for stealing and then what was mentioned in Proverbs 6. But I think for time's sake, we won't jump into that.
Yeah. Also, I have a little thing to add. Maybe is I think sometimes Christians can get confused in this discussion with proportionality because of the fact that, like, in our view of salvation, like, everyone is guilty, and so we all need salvation. And so I think sometimes there's this idea that, like, all sins are equal in a way, and so it's like there's truth to that in the fact that we're all cosmically guilty before God, but even within God's final judgment, there's proportions of guilt. Like, if you reject, like, the more knowledge you have, and if you reject it, then there's greater punishment. And so I think just clearing that up quickly, that in God's law there is, even though we're all guilty in terms of his court, there's still differences in levels. And then there's also the now court of, like, human law and justice.
Yeah.
Well, God's law in the human court.
And that's a good point. Like, I feel like people, I mean, this is probably just everyone across the board, but people, use that phrase, well, sin is sin, and all sin, like, we're all guilty of sin, so why, like, they'll use that in the sense of, like, well, don't judge or whatever. But no one ever is willing to, like, apply that mindset all the way out, all the way through. Because if sin is just sin, and so, we shouldn't really be punishing them more severely, or we shouldn't be judging them because, like, look, you're guilty of sin. Well, the reality is then you can't judge someone for murder. And as a society, we have no room to judge someone for murder. Or it's sad, but people actually are less outraged at taking of human life than maybe they should. So we'll use the example of rape, which people are rightfully outraged about. But it's like, how are you going to judge a guy for murdering, or not murdering, raping a woman? Like, if you're saying that if all sins are equal and all sins are kind of like, essentially it's just like, hey, you know what, your adultery or, your pornography or whatever, it's like you shouldn't judge, someone for homosexuality because, well, we all have sexual sin or we struggle with it. It's like, well, then you don't get to apply it all the way across. You have to apply that concept all the way through. Like, we do see that there's differences in sin. We do see that some are more heinous, more severe, depending on the helplessness of the victim, depending on other kind of aspects that go into it, the act, the violence. It's like they're not all equal. And it's like, sure, all sin separates us from God, but not all sin is necessarily going to have the same impact on our fellow human beings.
Yeah, and also get proportions of guilt even in eternity. You see that with Jesus saying, like, these cities that didn't respond to my miracles and saw them, like, Sodom and Gomorrah will judge you because, like, they'll, like, you're going to fall lower than them because you had all this evidence. And so even eternally, there's that proportion in a way.
Yeah. So we'll move on then to the third one, which is, so we've got impartiality, we got proportionality, and then we've got conformity, which I've kind of touched on a bit, but it's this idea of requiring conformity to the standards that God has set forth in his word. So, especially you look at the 10 Commandments, but it's later on, it's expanded a bit. And then Jesus even, Jesus raises the bar even more. And so let's just ignore the first, 4, but let's just do the latter 6 on human to human interaction, right? We'll get back to the first 4 later. But it's like, if we were to just look at those latter 6, those human-to-human relationships, like, do not bear false witness, do not steal, do not murder, do not covet your neighbor's belongings, do not covet your neighbor's spouse. What is the 6th one? I'm missing one.
The 6th one is do not murder? Did you already say that?
I said don't. I'm not listening in order, unfortunately. So I said, don't bear false witness, don't steal, don't murder, don't covet your neighbor's belongings, don't covet your neighbor's wife.
Don't commit adultery.
Well, that was, I think, coveting your neighbor's spouse is the adultery thing, but...
That's part of the 10th commandment, and then the 9th is, 7th is don't commit adultery. It's fine.
Oh, separate? Oh, I just conflate the two? Oh,
it's fine.
Thank you.
Similar.
Gosh, I was like, dude, it's so funny because I was like, okay, knowing that all these laws are, like, knowing all these the 10 Commandments and whatnot, it's like, when you don't refresh yourself, it's like sometimes you start getting them confused or conflated. It's like, either way. So you've got these kind of various commandments that relate to human interactions. And Jesus does something interesting, which he kind of sums it all up. So when he was asked, what's the greatest commandment? First is to love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, which is like the first 4 commandments. Then, it was honor your father and mother.
Honor your father.
So, there we go. That was the 6th. So I'm pretty sure coveting your neighbor's spouse was lumped into one with adultery.
Yeah, well, I think the coveting thing was 10th is all the coveting one, and then 7th is adultery, and then 5 is honor your parents.
Yeah, and maybe I'm adding the word covet to it because of Jesus' discussion on lust. That's where I'm kind of getting. But basically, so let's just take a step back. So the Jesus expands the 6 commandments. So after expanding on the first 4 by saying, love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. So he expands on those, or he sums them up by saying that. Jesus then goes and sums up the latter 6 by saying, these all can be summed up by saying, love your neighbor as yourself, which has been the most abused Bible verse the last 2 years. I hate how people have taken it. And it's just basically, I think the most loving thing for you to do is this. So, hey, you should do this because I see this as loving. But it's like, that's not what the verse is saying. That's not what the verse is meant to be used as. It's pointing back to the Old Testament. And in essence, what Jesus is saying is God's law that was created, several, thousands of years ago is still relevant for today. And then he kind of demonstrates it at other points because it's not just, hey, thou shalt not murder. But if you hate your brother in your heart, you're guilty of murder. And this is where maybe my whole coveting kind of thing where adultery, thou shalt not commit adultery. Jesus expands on it and says, if you lusted after another woman, so you're coveting a woman, you're desiring a woman that isn't your spouse. And he's talking, but it could be, vice versa. It could be women desiring men, or just you're desiring someone sexually that isn't your spouse. You've committed adultery. And so Jesus kind of raises the bar quite a bit, but the standard is still set. Here's some of these principles. We're not supposed to steal. We're not supposed to verify. Like, those are the things. And if our behavior, our practices, our business practices are not conforming to that, that's when we've got problems. So, like, you look at some of these companies, and if they've got some less than honest communications, like, hey, our product works great, but they hide a bunch of information that shows otherwise, well, that's bearing false witness. And so, they say it's safe to use, and then you discover this is harming people. Like, there's a lot of the controversy over some of the GMO stuff. And so it's like, are these GMOs, are they healthy for people? Or are they harming people? If it's causing, they're saying if these companies know that it's causing harm, but they're refusing to say, it's like, well, you're bearing false witness and potentially guilty of murder too by kind of association. So the question you kind of to be asking is, what has God said is good? What has he said is right? And what is true in specific circumstances? And then what standard has God laid out for us that relates to these circumstances? And what has God said is wrong and evil or unjust? And I think, we could, another one of those buzzwords, but, looking at it, it's like, are we using power in ways, our power or influence, whatever that is? I mean, you don't have to be, Bill Gates or Joe Biden or Donald Trump to be in power and oppress people. You can oppress people with whatever area of influence you're at. Like, as a husband and a father, I can be an oppressive presence in my household if I really, not if I cared to, if I didn't care. I could be oppressive to my kids. But, so it's like, are we, looking to figure out, okay, how has God defined some of these things? How has he defined, oppression? And am I acting in those ways? And not necessarily looking, it's like, I don't have societal power, so I can't be oppressive. So. Yeah.
And I think that goes back to having that whole holistic, view of justice and God's standard, and, all that stuff doesn't really happen with a theological minimalism of just, here are some nice little like statements. Like it happens, I think, through the whole life as we learn God's standard and be conformed and have our mind renewed. Like it's definitely not a like small thing of just check off a few boxes and then you're good. Like it's a theologically maximalist kind of thing.